It's good to be here today. So I walk around so I can. I'm good. All right. Good. All right. First, I want to give thanks to the people that are here that I know personally. So I give thanks to my family and my loved ones, my elders that are here. My brother is in the back. It's good to be here, mainly because of the responsibility of what this month means. Dr. Carter Woodson. The story about him is really interesting. He was born to two people that were identified as enslaved Africans. And his mother was well-read, she was literate, and his dad was a man that worked with his hands. He's really good with his hands. And at night, he would actually leave the plantation and he would go do odd jobs to make money. And one day, the slave owner found out through someone else that he had been leaving. And so he actually approaches him and says that you have to give me part of the money that you make or you can no longer do that work. And his father said, not gonna do that. And he fought him, which is equivalent to modern day of like fighting a police officer. And so he left and went to Virginia, where he met his mother. And they actually came together, and the legacy of Dr. Carter Woodson is that he was the first person born out of slavery. And later he would, at 17, he gets his BA, goes on and get his master's, and he's the first black man to graduate from Harvard University. And the thing that made him study people of African ancestry was his instructor said, what do you want to study? Why are you here? And he said, I want to study about my people. And he said, your people have no history. And that was the charge for him to write great literature and become an advocate, so to speak, for African people. And so he wrote the book, The Miseducation of the Negro, in 1933. If you read it in 2018, it's relevant right now. It's very much relevant. And so when people say folks are ahead of their times, he was definitely ahead of his time. And so when I think about Black History Month, I'm always thinking about his legacy. Always thinking about how he was able to fight through the social barriers that existed. How he was able to take someone's words and not allow them words to impact him in a way that discouraged him from actually pursuing something that meant something to him, and then creating a legacy. And so I think it was 1927 we look at the first time we actually celebrated Black History Week. And I think 76 became a month. And so it's really profound that we have this month, right? And I think for me, this month is about celebrating, learning, and reflecting. And so as we talk about history, it's really important for me to understand there's a whole story. So when I think about people of African ancestry during war times, it's actually a huge feat to think about that. How many folks, by a show of hands, know of anyone that served in the military? Anybody anywhere has actually served in the military? Hands up? All right, good. Let me look, Mike. Can we get the screen again? One more time. Okay. So it's really important for us to understand the formation of this country. The formation of this country helps us to acknowledge what were the principles that began to govern the society that also gave what? A status and perception of people of African ancestry. Status and perception. Status is what is your position, what is your ranking, and it was really important that we understand this, that the U.S. Constitution basically had a vested interest in keeping people of African ancestry enslaved. and that they were property, and that property had to be protected. And so the people that wrote that Constitution, they had a focus and an emphasis. And being that it was the governing document, like it was pretty much the founding document of this country, that began to create the experience of African people. So we can't talk about war times without understanding what was the foundation of this country. We can't talk about war times without understanding what was the status of African people. And we have to begin to think, has that status changed? How much of that document created a perception that lasted? And so for me, anytime I'm teaching a course, anytime I'm thinking about history, I think about the U.S. Constitution. I think about those 55 white men that were privileged white men, and they were wealthy. I think about the ones that had vested interest in slavery, but more so to protect their property. People of African ancestry were considered property. That's important to know. So when you're considered property, it's really hard for someone to have a level of humanity for you. See, we don't really care about our clothing. If you spend a little money on it, you might actually, okay, I'm going to keep it, I'm going to take care of it. But that clothing article, you can discard of at any point. It's property. We discard of all different types of property at any point. But the struggle for African people, historically and even modern day, has really been grounded in us having an experience that acknowledges our humanity. When I think about what happens in current day, I say there is a point in which people's humanity is being negated. And so for me, as we think about this, we think about the experience of those people that said, I want to sacrifice. I want to fight. They were fighting for their humanity. Could you hit that? So it's important for us to understand the landscape. So we have the founding document. Now we have to look at what were the principles that kind of govern how people experienced life. I'm like a person that studies racism. I think it's important to study racism. 50 years ago, racism was very differently. I'm only 39, but I know it was from what I've read. 1964, the Civil Rights Act created a more sophisticated understanding of racism. It shows it very differently. There's a time period that some folks, just by scanning the room, there's some folks in here that have seen some things be very different. They've seen segregated spaces, whether it be hotels, whether it be schools. Some people had to walk through the back door. And the thing about it is, in modern day, one, we live in California. California is a bubble. It's very interesting because the blatant racism here, the blatant racism doesn't really exist here in which it does in other places. And so when I'm working with young people, I'm inside of schools, a lot of folks are saying, oh, I don't see racism. It's only been since maybe Trayvon Martin, even go back a little Oscar Grant, that now we're starting to see in terms of those blatant acts before us. So it's really interesting because before 1964, it was legal to discriminate. So when I think about, in particular, the Double V campaign. Folks heard of the Double V campaign? Show of hands. The Double V campaign was basically a campaign by women of African ancestry that were really committed to fighting to ensure that they were seen. The Double V stood for double victory. Now, when the men said it, oftentimes they meant something a little different. They meant the victory abroad and the victory at home. The victory abroad was fighting against the quote-unquote enemy. The victory here was fighting against the institution that kept them oppressed. But for the women, they were fighting against two things: the racial barrier and the gender barrier. Before the civil rights, before World War II, there were very few women that worked outside of the home. You had some women that were professionals. You had some attorneys. you had some dentists, you had some teachers. But in terms of a large percentage of women, both white and black, they worked mostly either as domestics or in the house. So World War II shifted a lot in terms of family, in terms of who was in the work field. So when we understand racial etiquette, we have to say to ourselves, what was happening, right? What was happening? And what I would want people to understand, and the reason why this slide is so important, is because when people entered the military, they were fighting against a societal norm. A societal norm that said you are less than Europeans. Slavery created a status and maintained that. One of the early images of enslaved Africans were them actually being shown as happy to be enslaved. Do folks remember this? That they were shown as happy. Now that was important because if folks were to begin to look at what was happening here, or if the government needed to justify it, you had to make it seem as though that it wasn't causing a rift for people, that it wasn't harming folks. Thomas Jefferson said in 1778 that the largest obstacle impacting people of African ancestry was they were inferior both mind and body. That's rationalization to keep them enslaved. So then you fast forward and you think about the end of slavery, 1865, quote unquote. We know slave ships came all the way to 1867 to North America, all the way to 1881 in Brazil. Okay? But we're just giving time frames, right? So 1865, slavery supposedly ended. We went from having the images that people were accepting and happy to be enslaved to them being violent and deviant. Now that was important because now you need to be able to create an energy from other people to keep them what? Subservient. When you're enslaved, you're going to be subservient because the norms keep you subservient. When people were on plantations, people were brutalized in public intentionally. Why? Because if you see somebody being brutalized, you're less likely to go against what the norm is because you've seen what's happened to them. So then, if you move forward and you see this, at the end of slavery, this perception is created to create a really hostile, aggressive energy towards Africans. So when racial etiquette shows up, people are treated as second-class citizens. Meaning they were often offered the leftovers. As I studied history, some of the stuff that would stand out to me would be like, you would have people that were adults, and they had, they were referred to as gal, boy. These are adults. There's people that have to step off the curb because somebody's coming. But it was to reinforce what was their position. That you're less than. And so when I think about those men and those women that wanted to fight for this country, they had this really hard dynamic they were dealing with. Because this country saw them as being less than, saw them as being inferior. Intellectually, physically, and so they wouldn't even let them fight. You got to think about this. They wouldn't allow them to fight. The depth of it is thinking this. They didn't even want people of African ancestry to bleed with them. You couldn't die with them because of the status, because of how people were seen. Hit that slide for me. Whether it was the Revolutionary War, Civil War, World War I, World War II, any of our modern day wars, we fought in all those wars. I think it's really important that in this day I said to myself, I just want to make sure that I'm going to mention some names in this slide, but what I don't want to do is not acknowledge that there are countless people that gave their lives. They're not in any books. You can't find them on the internet. There are no pictures of them. There's a woman in here we're going to talk about. Her name is Sally Smith. And when I read about Sally, it made me laugh because it reminded me of some of the students that come to my class. Because Sally only wanted to be in the military because she wanted to be closer to her boyfriend. He was going to Italy. She heard that there was an auxiliary of women in the military, and they were going to be processing mail. And she was like, I can be closer to him. And I was like, that made me laugh because I have students that come to my class. I'm like, why are you taking my class? I'm like, oh, because my boyfriend says it's a good class. I'm like, all right. But what made me think about Sally, and the reason why I wanted to talk about her is because there's no picture of her. You can't find a picture of her on the internet, which made me kind of sad. Like, she was the first black woman to actually graduate from West Virginia University with a master's degree, right? And she worked extremely hard to do great work to ensure that people received the mail. And black women that were working in the mail corps, they took pride in it. And the reason why they took pride in it, because they said people need to know they're loved. Like when you're fighting, when you're away from your family, when you're dealing with the hardships of segregation, even in this institution that you want to believe in because you're fighting for something, you need those letters. So they took a lot of pride in that. And so racial segregation showed up in so many ways. During the Revolutionary War, initially people of African ancestry wasn't allowed to fight on either side. But then there was this push by the British that said, you know what, if you come fight with us, then we'll give you freedom. And so a lot of fugitives, per se, that were escaping from slavery actually fought for the British. And then what we know to be America modern day said, you know what, we don't want them fighting, but we're probably going to have to because there were so many people of African ancestry that were going and supporting the British. But what's really interesting is you read stories, and there were whites that were being asked to fight that owned slaves. And the law said you can't actually put a slave in the war. Reason being, they didn't want enslaved Africans to have guns. They were afraid of that. So what they said is, but if they're free, they can fight. So white slave owners that didn't want to fight would free some Africans. So if you were enslaved, they would free you and be like, okay, go ahead, now you can fight. Because they didn't want to. It was their way of exchanging their service. They can exchange her for somebody else. There's one kid, he was 13 years old. His slave owner gave him a nickel. He said, I want you to take my place and to fight in the war. And he did. Afterwards, he went back and he was still enslaved. He worked on that plantation for another 20 years before the slave owner passed away. Slave owner passes away. In the will, he leaves him money and gives him his freedom. Oh, interesting. I don't know. I struggled with that story when I heard it. I was like, I don't know if I should be happy. Kinda, not really. It's a struggle. Because for me, what would made most sense was for him to be free when he came back. And not have to work an additional time before now he gains his freedom. Right? But there were countless stories like that. And so when I think about this racial segregation around guns, a lot of the early folks that were entering the military, they worked in mess halls. They were the folks in the kitchen, the folks that were cleaning. Sometimes they were the folks that were actually working in factories, making sure that things were clean. Sometimes they had duties to just kind of guard the bases. But you would never see them working at any time period while whites were actually working unless the white person was the commanding officer. Segregation was very important. They did not want to be affiliated or in the same space as people of African ancestry. And so when we look at the segregation, we look at the bases, the mess halls, the infantries, the different sleeping quarters, these things had an impact on people psychologically. It had an impact on folks psychologically because folks actually really wanted to fight. When I was in college, I remember there was a time period where I thought about entering the military. And I only wanted to go because it would pay for my school. But when I studied these men and women, their reason for going was grounded in freedom. They really wanted to fight for this country. They truly believed this was their country. And I think it's always important when you talk about people of African ancestry that you know there's a spectrum of our experience. We don't all have the same beliefs. We don't have the same values. We come from different family backgrounds. And so even in the military, there's some people that became very disillusioned because they were very upset, very angry by what they were seeing. Folks were allowed to come, but they weren't allowed to fight. It makes me think about the triple nickel infantry. The triple nickel infantry. Now, for some folks in this room can remember that nickels used to have buffaloes on them. How many folks remember that? A few people say, okay, all right, cool. And the triple nickel infantry actually used to train on the same ground as the buffalo soldiers. And that's where they got that from. Because there used to be a buffalo on there and they said 3 5s, triple nickels. Now that infantry was important. They were parachuters. And they wanted to ensure that they could support around fires. During World War II, the Japanese used to drop something called balloon bombs. And it was really important to be able to have people that can put those fires out. Because of segregation, they were training them, but not training them. They could not be on planes. So they couldn't learn to jump. They couldn't actually carry some of the same materials that whites did. So you had an infantry of about 27 people. And in that infantry, folks became really upset because they were seeing the whites being trained. Whites getting an opportunity to be on the battlefield. And one of the sergeants, he said, you know, the way that I'm going to change this is to ensure that their morale stays up. So he says, I'm going to start training you all just like we're going to war. So he started training them every day, full gear. And he created a simulation, so to speak. He found this tower. And then he took from the top of the tower, he said, you know, I'm going to create like an embankment so then when people fall on it, they won't hurt themselves. So it was their way of practicing. So they would literally go up and they would, you know, go through routine, jump, and they were there and they're constantly preparing themselves. A white officer saw it. So Morris is called to the office. Morris is afraid. He's like, He couldn't sleep the whole night because he heard the night before he had to go, so he was really concerned. He couldn't sleep. So he gets up and he goes. And he talks to one of the captains. And the captain says, "What are you doing?" He says, "My men, they had a low morale." He said, "They came to fight, to support the war and the war efforts." He was like, "But they're not getting opportunity." He was like, "You guys have pushed us away," in the sense of their base was at a different place than the whites. We're not able to train the way that other folks are training. We can't prepare for the war if we are to be called for duty. He said, so I started training them every day. And he was surprised that the lieutenant actually was happy and was smiling and said, "Well, you know what? I'm actually going to have you all begin to train with the white officers." It was a victory, somewhat. The white officers were not so accepting. They were very upset and didn't want anything to do with them. And so from that point on, they weren't able to still fight. So spent countless months just kind of waiting around. But they continue to practice and continue to practice. And one of the things that happened that was so powerful is that after a while, they were called to actually go on what they call smoke duties. Smoke duties is basically when there's a fire, you go put the fire out. And so they were called to do that. And they were really excited to be able to do that work. But it was hard work. It was work no one wanted to do. Because you would be dropped in the middle of a fire. And your job was to contain that fire. There will be 5 to 10 men dropped in the middle of, a forest area. And they would have to put that fire out. Everything they needed, they carried on their backs. Now, the thing that people have to understand, how many people have jumped out of a plane before? Oh, nobody? Oh. I thought y'all all jumped out of planes. In their training, they knew that they had to jump out of those planes, just as practice before they began to put out those fires. And they talked about how, once you walked up those stairs, you couldn't walk back down those stairs. Not for you, but for all people. Because the moment you walk down those stairs, that's going to be a reflection of all men, all women that are in the military. So folks talked about being very scared about jumping out of planes, that training wasn't easy. And typically, it was like you had your parachute and then you had your backup. And usually they said, you would go, and you get ready, and before you can even collect yourself, you were already out. Because you actually didn't get a chance to jump, they just pushed you out. And they would talk about, literally you had once you fell, you had about 3 seconds to pull that chute. And then once you pulled that chute, they said it was like this whizzing in your ear, and you was coasting. The interesting thing is that it was almost 2 to 3 years later after they were allowed to actually be a part of putting out these fires, that they actually began to give them parachutes where they can actually control them. So you can control where you fail. Which was important because if you're falling in forest areas, it could be very dangerous. So people would wear nets over their faces to ensure that the tree branches weren't scratching them up. But they would have to carry water and food, and it was difficult. Once those fires were out, sometimes they were 20 to 30 to 40 miles away from the nearest road. So when they put those fires out, they had to walk. And then sometimes wait a day, 2 days to actually be picked up. But this was normal. This was normal. The thing about the triple nickel is that 17 men out of the original number actually all were certified jumpers. Of all 17, they all lived. They worked throughout World War II, and they all lived. They had over 100 jumps, put out over 26 fires. Now, it's complicated because if you read in history books, they're not really talked about. The reason why they're not really talked about is because some people argue that the fires that were being started weren't by the Japanese, that they were actually started by the American government as a way to pacify these black soldiers, because they didn't want them fighting in the war. However, when medals were awarded, they all received medals because they said that if the infantry was integrated, that they would have been some of the best based on what they were able to do in those forests. And so the legacy of them is really, really powerful because they were dedicated in a way that I think that gets overlooked. When I think about soldiers, both the men and women, I think of a lasting legacy, a lasting legacy. When people of African ancestry talk negatively about this place we call America, people say that we're unpatriotic. Our loyalty gets questioned. And for me, when I read and study, I recognize that they were the epitome of being patriotic. Patriotic means to be loyal, to be committed. They were loyal and committed to a place that wasn't loyal and committed to them. Every day. And what's interesting, they had a level of courage and hope that I'm not sure some of us have in modern day. Hope because they would wake up believing that it was going to be different. Courage because every day they recommitted themselves to that process. And so, hit that slide for me. There's some of the environmental things important for us to be mindful of. So, looking at, there were people that are actually beaten and brutalized while wearing their uniforms. They're in full uniforms. Sometimes by people in the public, sometimes by actual officers in the military. We created a very hostile environment for African people. When I talk about the Constitution, talk about racial segregation, it's important for us to know that people internalize those things. People internalize that folks were subservient, that folks were less than them, and they wanted to ensure that folks stayed in that place. It was really, really sad when you think about, like, in Alexander specifically, that like these two soldiers, they were just walking down the street. And they were actually attacked. And the reason why it became a riot is because when the two white military officers approached them and began to harm them, other black officers began to interfere. Then white civilians joined in, and it became a riot. But these were actually normal accounts, because a lot of the whites didn't want to see blacks serving this country. They actually felt like it was disrespectful. So when I talk about courage, just thinking about the reason why we can come through this door right here, even though it says emergency exit, not because of somebody's belief, but because of a law. Folks had to go through the back door, if even permitted. There were countless riots. There was some black welders that was told that you're going to be integrated into a welder's unit that's all white. And so they're excited. They're going to actually be able to be integrated. To be integrated was thought to be this amazing feat because racial lines were being crossed. People felt like that was a level of success and achievement. And when they got there, those white welders turned on their actual machines and began to attack those black welders. Those black welders fought back, but what they decided was they need to have separate spaces. So some of the violence maintained the status quo. And so it was really important that people remain hopeful and committed, because these were normal accounts. You can hit that. John Hope Franklin, he's an historian, but he was also a man that entered the Navy. He said, if I was able physically, mentally, every other kind of way, able and willing to serve, then my country turned me down on the basis of my color, then my country did not deserve me. That was his sentiments. Now, that was him being turned away from the Navy. I don't know if you all know, but he became a great historian. So he has written a lot of texts about our experience. So I guess I appreciate him not being in the military, because it allowed him to write a lot and become very educated. But that was John Hope Franklin's sentiments, right? Next one. So there may be a whole lot wrong with America, but there's nothing that Hitler can fix. Just perception. Just perception. Next one. Says, I didn't hesitate to come when I believed I was needed. I honestly believe that I compromised an important part of this nation. That he felt like he was a part of it, right? And it was patriotic, it was patriotic duty. My attitude has greatly changed. He felt like it was important for him to be a part of this country. He felt like he was, but not because of the reality. Next one. He said you could cut prejudice, you could see it, you could smell it. Next one. Now this is Morris from the Triple Nickels. He says, I was stuck with the sudden understanding of my reason for being there. Why would a black man risk his life to help his country? The answer was simple. This is my country. It's a very powerful statement. He said, this is my duty regardless of the social climate, regardless of the fault. This is my country, my children's country, and their children's. It's up to me and the many, many people of all races and cultures to fight the haters and races to make this a better place to live. You hear a lot in there. Like, the thing that stood out to me is how, growing up, it's like I said, I grew up in 78. I was born in 78, grew up in Oakland in the 80s, and I often felt like this wasn't my country. I often felt like I didn't feel welcome here. And to hear a lot of my elders and ancestors talk about their commitment, it resonates with me. Because what they're often referring to is all that they did, all that they gave to build this country up. The Women's Corps, all the women that went to the military. I think about the nurses. Some of the first nurses were flown overseas. And they were the ones that were helping the white soldiers. You got to think about this. They don't want you there. They're fighting against you, but they were the first ones to take care of those white soldiers. The first ones on the scene, so to speak. Right? Next one. This is Triple Nickel. These gentlemen, I'll say for me, the most impressive part about them is just their commitment. and Morris, their sergeant, his efforts to continue to persevere. They accomplished a great deal, and if it weren't for them, you wouldn't see the number of black men and women that are able to jump from planes, able to be fighter pilots like they gave themselves. They gave themselves in ways that I don't know if we truly understand. Because they recognize that it wasn't for them. That even though they had a commitment, but it was for the greater community. It was for this society. Next slide. This is what I spoke of earlier, and I think it's really important. There's a text that's written that I would recommend. It's called Double Victory. And what's interesting about this book is that it just talks about the story of women. It's a very, very powerful book. And some of the people in here that I just admired a great deal was like Willa Brown in Chicago. And Willa Brown was the first woman licensed as a pilot. The first woman licensed as a pilot, but she was a teacher, entrepreneur, a wife, and she was an advocate. She had a strong voice because she was turned down initially. And because she was turned down, you know what she did? She said she wanted to be a pilot. So she was able to actually get her license, but she started her own school. Her and her husband started their own school. Next thing about what you talk about, we need to have our own, right? She started her own school. Says, if you're not going to do it, I'm going to do it myself. After the government saw what she was doing, they actually gave her funds to begin to train younger black pilots. So she opened up a school, and she started off young. They were like between 10 and 15 that she was preparing them to be pilots. There's a relationship between her and the Tuskegee Airmen. She actually trained a lot of the instructors for the Tuskegee Airmen, which is powerful. And I think what's even more powerful about this text is that when you begin to study military, you rarely ever hear about women. Like, we can think about the movies and they talk about like the black male experience, but we rarely ever hear about women. What were their experience? Willa Brown, she stood out. And the reason why she was able to have some leeway is from some of the women that she was in contact with, because a lot of the women were in partnership, so to speak. She had friends that were journalists. So when she was experiencing discrimination, she said, put it in the paper. And so they did, a lot of the discrimination were put in papers. It was a way to kind of put it out there, what was happening in different parts. It wasn't, we didn't have the internet. So it wasn't like you can, put something on the internet and it would go across the world. So newspapers were very important, right? Next. Oh, thank you. Folks heard Charity Adams? Very beautiful woman, very smart, very brilliant. Highest ranking woman during World War II, right? Highest ranking. She was able to command her own battalion overseas. She had over 80 women under her. But what's mostly powerful about her is that she was able to train 8 women under her to also become lieutenants. Very powerful, very strong-minded, very determined. Now, one of the things that I will say, as I studied and studied and studied, and I think it's important for us to put this out here, is colorism is real. Colorism is real. Because a lot of the blacks that were able to achieve success and move forward in the military were people that were of lighter complexion. We just have to recognize what is. Right? They weren't of darker complexion. So we just want to put that out there as we recognize like a lot of the images that I went over and a lot of the people that I saw. I was like, wow, like it just stood out to me. Right? We know in general that the whites didn't want to be commanded by blacks. It was very, very hard for blacks to become commanding officers. And when they did, they were folks of lighter complexion. Even when I think about like even some of the attorneys, right? So William Hastings, folks who know William Hastings. William Hastings was very, very powerful because he was actually one of the people that trained who we know as Thurgood Marshall, along with Charles Houston, right? And it was his work with the NAACP that was actually advocating on the behalf of people of African ancestry to kind of shine a light on what was happening to get FDR's attention. FDR was so afraid of losing political clout and support of black people that he informally established his own black cabinet. This was his advising group. Mary McLeod Bethune was a part of that group. But he wanted to ensure that he kept the black votes. And so when William Hastings approached him, William Hastings spent a lot of time making sure that he was clear on what was happening. So Charity Adams, she also was very, very vocal in a way that made sure that the resistance and the discrimination was put on Front Street. And so that's one of the things that stood out to me. Like when you study African American culture, one of the things that saddens me is that not many people know what that is. When I'm working with young people, they don't really know what that is. They can identify some components. I talk about music and food. But if I was to ask them to define it for me, they would have a hard time defining it. The culture piece is really important because culture connects to identity, right? One of the cultural attributes that's so important is this concept of resistance. The people of African ancestry, since being brought here as enslaved Africans, have had to resist. Now, some of that resistance was very blatant, in your face, and some of it was very subtle. A lot of the folks that were in leadership were very vocal. I think that's important to know. She was a very vocal person, very thoughtful person, very strategic, because people recognized you had to speak and strike, so to speak, at the right time. You just couldn't kind of move without direction. So a lot of the people, they were working in concert, so to speak, as I spoke about previously, in partnership. Next slide. So this is what I was sharing with you all about Sally Smith earlier, right? And I think if I was to say anything else about Sally, is that what she spoke about is that she was excited to go overseas to be closer to her boyfriend, but when she got there, she said it was very difficult. She said it was difficult because there was a lot of focus on those soldiers that came overseas. And that she found herself doing a lot of hard work. She said once she found a rhythm, so to speak, that she would be fine. And she came back, and her boyfriend, they got married, just so we all clear, they did get married. So she went, they got married, right? But she came back and she was able to complete her studies through the GI Bill. But I just wanted to uplift her because one of the things, some of these stories are so amazing. Like you see all these beautiful women and very intelligent and very thoughtful. Like you think about Lula Jones Garrett, right? She was a reporter. And one of the things that she did is she often talked about how women should be women. But she said, you know what? She only did that as a way to be able to get the position. Because her real focus was really talking about how do we change the lives of women. That was her real focus, right? And so one of the things she talked about, she says, she wrote about the hard news. She said, you define the hard news as what was happening with women here and abroad. So in 1941, a lot of women were coming out of the homes and working in shipyards. So like right here in Richmond, there were a lot of women working in the shipyards. Very challenging time. But a lot of the women experienced a lot of early discrimination because they were women. Initially, when it came to people entering the military, if it weren't white men, they wanted white women that were single. If that population became, not accessible, then they wanted married white women. Once that population became inaccessible, then they wanted black men, then black women. And because it was still allowed, 1948 signifies the point in which the military became integrated. 1948. So before then, it was always separated. And so when people would actually go to become a part of the military, they would say, we don't have any jobs. Now, it's important to note that those jobs pay very well. So some people were very committed because they wanted to fight for this country, but some folks said they're paying really well, I want a job. People were trying to change the economic situation. And so when I think about the commitment, the time frame, it makes me very thoughtful about what are people willing to risk in modern day. Because they risk a lot every day. Whether it was working in shipyards, whether it was working overseas, whether it was working on cars. There were a lot of women they were actually mechanics. It was interesting because I think a lot of the men struggle with women actually taking up different roles that weren't necessarily ascribed with the roles of women. That was changing how society was understanding the position of women. That's one thing I appreciate about the text and reading is that these women were very, very geared towards changing how society saw them. Where were they supposed to be? There wasn't a woman's place. It's important that there wasn't a woman's place because I remember growing up hearing that there's a place for a woman or to be ladylike. And the women that were in the military didn't believe in those ideas. They didn't believe in patriarchy or believe in sexism as it begins to impact people in modern day. They're very focused on changing their reality and the reality around them. People of African ancestry in the military fought against a lot of hardship. But I think one of the things that stands out to me the most is that what they did with those uniforms on changed a lot for people that weren't wearing those uniforms. It changed a lot. It offered more access. It offered more opportunities. And it challenged the status quo of America. Every time people were resisting, it challenged, how does this society govern itself? What should people have access to? It said something to me that in 48, those spaces became less segregated. But it also said something to me that once they were less segregated, that there wasn't a push to keep them that way. Because there were still some spaces where folks weren't allowed. And so I often struggle because if you're to think about it, during that time we were doctors, mechanics. We were holding high positions all throughout the military. And it made me think about what was the motivation once folks left. Because once folks left, sometimes they experience a lot of difficulties after they've served their time. And as I read and studied, and this is something I think stands out the most, is just the level of achievements inside countless medals, countless barracks that were integrated, change in leadership. So I think there's something to be said about service. How do we define it? What does it mean? And what service should continue? I think the women and men in World War II offered us in modern day a different reality. And if I could say anything in closing, is that I would actually encourage folks to spend time talking to people that have served. I spent some time talking to folks. And it made me very humble. Because what they've endured, I haven't. And they laid a foundation for me to be able to live a quality of life that they didn't have. And so for that, I'm ever grateful.
So Professor Seals, you talked about the GI Bill a little bit, about possibly wanting to use it yourself for education. Do you believe that the GI Bill was something that was able to help discriminatory practices in housing and education, or was it something that was negative for African Americans?
Am I on? Yeah, go ahead.
You're good.
All right. I think I have a varied view about the GI Bill. I think the GI Bill does provide people of color the opportunity to be able to achieve their educational endeavors. However, I do think, it does impact people. I mean, one could actually be like there are different time periods in this country where folks were, required to go to the draft, right? And so that impacted, their ability to be able to complete school or whatnot. When I was in school, I can remember when I was in graduate school, one of my grad assistants, he was called to duty. And so, it impacted him in that way. I think it can be used as a tool. I just think that it depends on what's going on with this country, to be honest. And so it affords people some opportunities, but I also think that we have to be mindful that it supports certain people. So for instance, if you go to most inner city schools, what you see is the military on those campuses in terms of recruitment. They're not recruiting from Los Gatos High School. They're not recruiting from Piedmont High. You go to those schools, you see the Yales, the Browns, the Stanfords. So to me, it is very much a class-based, race-based initiative, right? I mean, yeah, you have certain people that go to prestigious institutions like West Point, but that's not the norm, right? And so I think it's important to look at who's the target audience and how they're benefiting.
Again, I don't have a question, just a comment. You were talking about the service people free when they came home or free when you come back. And it just reminded me of my dad. He was one of the few combat sergeants in his unit in Korea. And he was excited to serve. This was during the 50s. And he thought, this will be it. When I come back home,
Right.
This is going to be the change. Well, when he came back home, he took advantage of the GI Bill and went to school, got his degree, and it still wasn't enough. He was basically broken by this country when he got back because his expectations while he was leading his troops in battle and he came back with shrapnel, he thought, I'm going to be a new man. And ultimately, he ended up rejecting this country and moving to Africa.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Because of that.
Yeah.
His expectations were are so high after service, and just, the racism is just as virulent, and even more so, because, they recognize him as a serviceman, and for some reason that, struck a raw nerve with a lot of the racists.
Yeah. It's an important story. I mean, it's an important acknowledgement, an important part of the story to be told is like, how were people seen and what was their experience when they returned back? And then like, how do people find solace? So you said he left. Yeah. That's actually been, I guess fortunately or unfortunately, however you look at it, that's been the response of quite a few people.
Has there been, is there any type of study that documents the experience of veterans post-World War II, Korean War, and then modern days? And then what would you say, if there are studies on it, the biggest difference between modern vets as opposed to Korea or World War II? I know it's a huge question.
So I want to get this straight. So you said, are there any studies around the experience of people of African ancestry in the military post-World War II?
Veterans, so World War II vets, Korea vets, and modern vets,
Uh-huh.
experiences or the impact.
Well, there's quite a few books written about the experience afterwards. I think what we've learned is that because of World War II, there have been advancements, so to speak, in terms of positions people can acquire, access in the military. So we've seen that shift. However, I think racism in general still plagues the military, like most U.S. institutions, and so it's not as direct as it once was. I think there are some things that's embedded. So earlier when we were talking about the GI Bill and how like there's some of these armed forces that are on high schools. I think we also have to recognize too, when they're on high school campuses, if you enter the military straight out of high school, the path that you're on, you can never supersede somebody that enters in college, from college, right? And so if you're targeting a group of people that's in inner city communities, then you're already placing them at a lower status than someone else that's going to be entering through college. And so I think we have to recognize like how people are being, kind of tracked, so to speak, to be in certain positions in the military.
Anyway, I want to make a comment first. First of all, I don't understand, and I've never understood why white folks have believed, and still believe in the manifest destiny, as far as them coming from on ships and things like that, where they have been persecuted and come to the United States of America and still think that they are superior, even though they may have come in different types of situations of oppression, yet they still feel like they should oppress other people. That's then and now. That's just a comment. Secondly, you talked about the integration in 1948 of the military people. I want to find out about pay. She mentioned something about Rosie the Riveter, and I want to ask her about black Rosie the Riveters, because I would assume that they would be at the bottom of the pay scale. So during the wars, World War II, were the black veterans paid the same thing while they were in the military? And once they came out and became welders or whatever, were they then still paid equal pay once they were, ex-veterans and, then working in a different field?
No, I mean there's always been a divide racially in terms of money and gender-wise. I mean that's not new, and it's public information. And the thing that we have to be mindful of is before it was integrated and before the Civil Rights Act, everything was pretty much public knowledge, and people had to accept what was. And then you had time period around 42 when women were entering the military and they basically were volunteers. They weren't being paid at all. So when you ask about Rosie the Riveter, like that time period, there were women that worked in the factories that weren't being paid. And that's normal though. I mean, we think about even going further back during the Great Depression, there were countless women that were domestics that they just didn't get paid. People would come and do the service, and they would say, we're not paying you. And so, I mean, it's not new. I think it's something we've dealt with, but it's something we still deal with to this day. I mean, the professions that people have are very much tracked based on their parents' socioeconomic status, what schools they attend, what access they have based on the school they attend, then often provides a trajectory on how much money they're going to make. And it's still racially segregated. I'm in academia, and there's very few people of color in higher ed, even in modern day. Most of the professors that I'm in areas with are white men. Most of the teachers that are in grade schools are white women. I mean, there's still a lot of segregation. I mean, that's normal. I think it's funny, like, I'm thinking about a lot of our conversations we've had, but segregation is interesting because it's still very much real today. I mean, if we just identify certain neighborhoods in Oakland, if we say Fruitvale, we know who stayed there. If we say West Oakland, we know who was staying there and who's staying there now. We say East Oakland, we know who stayed there. So, I mean, like, segregation's real. You know, I also do some work over, I think about, like, the work that happens over at Merritt, you know, and I think about stuff, like, I was doing a project over at Stanford, and, like, just because Stanford has 5% population of people of African ancestry doesn't mean it's an integrated school. Berkeley has 33,000 students. Less than 1,000 of them are people of African ancestry. In modern day, we're not talking about 50 years ago, in modern day. So that's still, to me, is segregation. And and it's not like you can't go there now. The issue is now is that you can't afford to go there, or there's still practices where they're still identifying that you might not be able to pay, or you might be the wrong color, because they don't necessarily ask for your race anymore. Now they're just doing what they call zip code scans. So based on where you live, now they know who stays there, right? So segregation is real, has always been real, and I'm not sure how we're gonna get around it, because right now we're dealing with gentrification, and it's a sad struggle with gentrification. Because part of me is actually excited about some of the changes we see, but it's hard because people are being pushed out. You know, like I think about, I spent some time in Africa over this summer, and people would ask me like, oh, it was so poor there, huh? And I'm like, you mean like all the tents I see in Oakland? That's what you're talking about? Because I didn't see that on the continent, right? So I think we just have to be mindful of segregation is real, pay segregation is real, not just for people of color, but also in terms of like gender. And so it's a struggle right now, and I think those are the barriers we're still actually fighting against.
Well, you would think that the military, since it's been integrated or whatever, has learned some lessons. But when I hear things on the news, like people that are, not from this country, but serving in the military for the United States of America, come back and are not given immediate citizenship and are, sent back to their country of origin. It's like the military may have learned some things, but they haven't learned enough yet.
Yeah.
The African American population is about 12 or 13% of our total population. Do you know in the Vietnam War it was much higher than that of those who served? Yes. And also, since soldiers were scorned generally from coming back from that war, the African American soldiers have a harder time coming back to Vietnam sometimes.
Well, I can't speak to the first question. I can't speak to that. But the second one, I definitely think so. I think the climate in Vietnam was terrible, based on America entering someone else's land, right? And we had no idea what we were encountering, right? But I also think that it was just as bad coming back. There was a lot of trauma that people experienced coming back because of what they saw, right? And I think we're still learning about that impact. I think we're still studying it. I don't think there's enough energy and effort put towards studying how we could have, like what took place in terms of psychological damage. right? I don't think there's been enough energy around that. And I think we actually don't spend enough time. I think it's something we're starting to do, looking at where people are at psychologically around warfare and the outcomes of being in war, entrenched in violence.
My question has to do with whether or not you have studies on how the soldiers, the African-American soldiers in World War II were affected via the GI Bill. Because my father served in the military, World War II, Marine. And there was a GI Bill for going to school, but it's also a GI Bill that allowed people to build homes and how that impacted the African-American community. So many African-Americans were in the military, took advantage of the GI Bill as far as going to school, but also as far as helping to start and build middle class, a black middle class. And I don't know if you have any stats. Now, believe me, I'm not one of these rosy person that thinks that life is all fine and all this. I'm from the deep South, where KKK hung out, and they made sure I went to bed at night because they were in my window. So I have a different viewpoint. I have a very vivid viewpoint of how this country has moved very little, and but I have to be a realist and understand what the military has meant to my family, many families that I know of that attended college, graduated from college,
Right, absolutely.
and took from it the fact that, yes, they fought, yes, they may have believed in this country, but we're not surprised that it was still another lie. And when you grow up with people who lie and you see for colors and for whites and you enter this place or you go on the back entry to stores and that's just your normal life,
Right.
you really don't expect this pie in the sky view.
Right.
And so you take the best of what it is out there and then you just receive from that. So I was just wondering, do you have any studies or any studies that will tell you that there were academic as well as economic benefits for and how that impacted the African Americans who went to war, because it did help create a part of Black, what's perceived as middle class, and the Black academia, because so many people went to school after they returned from, especially World War II, and they were a lot of them became educators and whatever, but it did benefit. In a small way, not in proportion to what it should have done, but it did benefit.
So I think some of what you're saying. So some of what you're saying, we definitely want to recognize, right? So there definitely were some strides, right, in terms of people being able to make a living for themselves. And I spoke to that earlier, how some people, they knew that it provided economic opportunities for them and their family. I think more people, from my readings, have actually benefited from the educational piece than from the housing piece. Doesn't mean everybody didn't benefit from it, but because of housing regulations, and whether it was redlining, there was a lot of policies in place that was impacting people from not utilizing those vouchers, right? And so some people did benefit and some people didn't. And I think it's the policies that was based in certain geographic areas that began to determine whether folks were going to use those things or not. But I do think it was a platform for people to change their quality of life. And I think it benefited some, and then I think some people didn't benefit from it. I think the question the other gentleman brought up around the impact psychologically sometimes interfere with how people were able to benefit from it economically, because people were not themselves, right? The trauma began to impact how they can even be present for themselves or for their families. And so, and I think too, you bring up the piece that you're from the South, and so looking at geographic area, where were most people's experiences in different areas, right? And so I think that plays a huge part too. I think a lot of people move west, right? And some people expect the West to be different. In some cases it was, some cases it wasn't. Right.
This is kind of, firstly, thank you so much for coming out here and talking. And this is kind of more projected to the future. And the work that I do is, I'm a female in a male-dominated field, and I oftentimes struggle trying to not preach to the crowd per se, where I'm, talking and everybody's going, yeah, I agree with you. How do you propose to have the tough conversations with allies and with people that come from an outsider perspective, wanting to know more? I really wish I could ask my second question. That was my
So, want to get clear. So you're asking, how do we have spaces so people can
difficult conversations.
have different?
Because it's hard to appeal for me. I like talking as a feminist. It's hard to have people that are allies feel comfortable coming to a space to have those hard conversations. Does that make sense?
Well, the problem is people have what we call diversity fatigue, where a lot of people don't want to be in those same spaces talking about diversity all the time, because typically what that means is that one person's going to feel good, another person's going to feel like they're responsible for the other person's experience, right? So it's a hard space to be in. So what I always say is we got to create safe, brave spaces. And what that looks like is that some people live in the red. What I mean by that is some people live in the danger zone all the time, right? So when we talk about learning spaces, sometimes we say that people need to come into the danger zone to learn. But it's hard because some people live in the danger zone. So they don't really want to necessarily subject themselves to be the tool for somebody else's learning, right? But I do think that we have to, the way that we learn is being uncomfortable. So that means that we have to have conversations and engage in activities where people feel uncomfortable. But that's a practice, right? And that's hard. I think diversity is a fact, right? I think inclusion is a practice, and equity is the goal. But we struggle that when people are included, do they feel like they belong? And so I would say it's just, are people willing? Are people willing to sit in uncomfortable spaces, right? So when I teach a class, and the class is, I teach an African American literature class, and it's called Through Her Eyes. It's all literature written by women of African ancestry talking about their experience. I tell the brothers, sit, just learn, just sit, right? We just have to sit and be present and learn. And sometimes it's hard just to sit and hear, because like, oh, that's not me. We don't want to hear that. It's for you to learn. And it's the same thing. So for me, with allies, you can't be a comfortable ally. You gotta be willing to be uncomfortable. And you gotta accept whatever role is your role. You don't get to define your role in somebody else's experience around their liberation. So, yeah.
And I also, okay. A lot of us have been in different experiences. I've noticed the trend of now the new face of racism, right? And I wanted to kind of ask you to recall what you were saying earlier when you were talking about with your students. You said that it's almost like the implied post-racial culture, right? Where they're colorblind or something of that nature. And I was wondering how, because growing up, it seems like people don't respect history as much. Like my generation, I saw that start to happen, where we learned about the civil rights movement, right? But then modern racism, what does that look like? How do you have that conversation with people who can't respect history?
Well, I would say I think people do respect history. I have a few of my students in here, and they would tell you that my job is, when I talk about history, I'm always making a connection between history and modern day. So it's relevant. So if I'm talking about Oakland, I'm talking about Oakland when I grew up, but I'm also giving them that historical piece. So it's relevant for them because they live in Oakland, but then they're also learning about what it was. So I could talk about, it used to be Emporium Capitals. They're like, what? Where? And then I talk about where it was. And they're like, oh, for real? Or we talk about, somebody was like, they were like, Brother Jason, have you been to Uptown? I was like, Uptown where? Like, the Oakland I grew up in, there was no Uptown. But now Uptown is where the Uptowns are, right? So I mean, I think you have to use the tools around you. So whether it's video, whether it's music, whether it's skits, use tools to engage history. History is fun. And, you know, I teach ethnic studies, and so I'm always teaching history. I just think it's how it's presented and how relevant is it for them. Like, I don't push dates, but I push context. Right? Now, dates, I do think there are some dates you should remember, like your phone number, though. Like my mother, I couldn't leave the house unless I knew my phone number, right? So I do think people of African ancestry should know some dates. There's some dates, if I say it, I feel like the whole room should know, but I'm not going to test nobody, but just saying. So I think it's presentation, and I would say I think a lot of people do want to know. And I was having a conversation. I end on this. I was having a conversation with one of my good friends, and we were talking about what happened in modern day that kind of sparked what people are kind of connected to right now. This whole like, oh, people are woke, right? Which I think there's a level of consciousness across the board. I think the brother on the block that's selling drugs have consciousness, right? It's just different type of consciousness, right? And so I just think what has sparked it, and I think for me what has sparked it is that there's been a certain series of events that has made people want to learn. So now you have a lot of YouTube scholars, which is interesting. You know, and I think now you have a lot of people that like it's fun, so to speak, right, to learn about certain things. And so I think you have to use a platform that young people are using. So I'll pull something from YouTube. I'll pull something from Instagram. I'll pull something from Snapchat. Oh, that's what you're looking at? Now I'm gonna look at it with you. So now we can examine. Now I can take this idea, right, that's on Instagram, and now I can talk about it and connect it to history. Like, well, I'll be like, oh, so you know Marcus Garvey had 2 million followers. Oh, he did that without Instagram. Right? And they're like, oh, well, who was Marcus Garvey? And then, you know, well, what did he do? Oh, there's my entryway.
That's all, man.